Welcome everybody to this special talk about decolonial metal in Latin America, where people from the International Society of Metal Music Studies, of Metal Hammer, the editorial board specifically, and one special guest from the Peruvian metal band Flor de Loto sit together to discuss what decolonial metal is and how people encounter it and how we can draw attention to its unique capacities to transform the world. We'll start with a brief round of introductions, starting first with Eleanor Goodman of Metal Hammer.
Hi there, I'm Eleanor Goodman. I'm Deputy Editor at Metal Hammer, and I work with Rich, who is also on this call. And we've done a few features on Nelson's films, looking at different parts of Latin America and the bands and the scenes that have grown up around there. So it's very cool to be here today.
Rich?
Hello, I'm Rich. I'm a staff writer for Metal Hammer and Load It Online. And as Eleanor just said, obviously we've written a few features on Nelson's documentaries in the past, and just have a sort of general interest in covering and shining a light on scenes that are emerging really around the world, because it's obviously an important way for how metal develops as a genre and as a scene.
Alejandro?
Hello to everybody. I'm Alejandro Jardin from the band Flor de Loto. We're from Peru, and we have worked before with Nelson in his documentary Songs of Injustice. I'm very happy to be here.
I'll briefly introduce myself. My name is Didier. I am a lecturer and PhD researcher at the Erasmus University Rotterdam, and I recently published, or I'm preparing to publish, my first chapter on indigenous metal music in Aotearoa, New Zealand. And then to the author of Decolonial Metal in Latin America, Nelson.
Well, thanks everybody for being here, part of the panel. I'm Nelson. I'm a metal fan, a researcher, social psychologist, and professor at Florida International University. And I thank you for joining together to discuss the book, Decolonial Metal in Latin America.
Thank you again, everyone, for being here. Nelson, let's get started with you as somewhat of the expert on decolonial metal, specifically Latin America. Can you please tell us what we should understand what decolonial metal is?
Yeah, I mean, well, I guess that's a very first basic question. What are we talking about? I think it's interesting to also think about not only what are we talking about, but how I came to, meet the people who are actually doing decolonial metal. So most of the people that know my work usually know the film side of it, the documentary films that I've been working on for the last 10 years throughout the Caribbean and Latin America. And this book, it's basically an ethnographic account of the people I met while traveling and filming those documentaries. And so people who have seen those films might have noticed that there's a change in the way that they've been developed. They go from basic documentation of scene formation to outright decolonial approaches for metal music. And I think that's a reflection of the people I keep meeting along the way while I travel throughout Latin America, who are using metal music to inform others and to transform themselves in the process of becoming aware of the ongoing legacy of colonialism in the region. Part of what these bands are doing is that they are, first becoming informed of how colonialism is manifested and the ongoing implications of it right now. And then they are transforming their sound, transforming their lyrics, and transforming their visual aesthetics to challenge that colonial legacy, right? So from the outside, it might look like a simple act of integrating a regional instrument. But when you actually have a conversation with the people who are using those regional instruments, they explain how that is linked to a reflection on the devaluing of the local through the colonial process, and how metal music is transforming itself in order to highlight, the importance of those marginalized by colonialism, and highlight how colonialism is still alive today in the region. One clear example in the book, and I think it's great that Alejandro is here with us today, is Flor de Loto, one of the bands that I met while traveling throughout South America, particularly in Peru, and our conversations immediately turned into, why do you integrate these particular instrumentations and arrangements into your music, which are very folky, very local, very tied to indigenous populations. And it was interesting to see how Flor de Loto immediately said, this is a way of fighting, institutional racism linked to the colonial experience in the country. And for an outsider, it might look like just a changing of metal through a particular sound. But it was interesting to me when I have the conversations with the band and when I start making a friendship with the band to find out that it's much more than that. It's a process of decolonizing, yourself, your mind, and helping others decolonize the way that they see the world and their origins through the region. So I think Flor de Loto and Alejandro will be able to explain this much better than I, but it's a great example of decolonial metal, that metal that is trying to understand and critically assess how we challenge colonialism today. That's a short definition of what decolonial metal might be, or what it can be, that I post in the book. One of the chapters is on Peru and Alejandro.
I guess for people who are keen to learn more about the different facets of what decolonial metal is, we can gladly refer them to that first chapter of your book, where you outline 6 very clear aspects of what it really entails. But I think indeed it's a very good moment to go to you, Alejandro, and ask, how did you go about this transformation indeed that Nelson describes that decolonial metal does to decolonize not only yourselves, but the society around you as well, specifically Peruvian society?
Well, it's like Nelson just said. It's not only about changing the music. It has also a bigger meaning, a bigger purpose. And that purpose is to let the people know and acknowledge our culture, not only the people in Peru that are not aware of this, but also the people in the whole world, because we have a very rich culture and a very rich music background here in Peru, because we have, for example, music from the indigenous, from the Peruvian jungle. We have music from the Andes, and also indigenous music from the coast of Peru. We have a lot of cultural baggage. So we, Flor de Loto, as a band, want to get the people to know this, and to acknowledge also with our music that this has been tried to disappear by the Spanish when they first got to conquer Latin America. And although we are not a colony anymore, there's a lot of way of thinking and a lot of things that our government does that acts the contrary. They, for example, try to they see us indigenous people like second-class citizens, and we do not agree with that. So by mixing Peruvian instruments, in our case, wind instruments like zampoña, quena, for example, we try to cut the attention of the people that they're listening. And they say, okay, they playing this hard music, but what are these melodies? What are these instruments? So they can investigate more about our culture, about all the indigenous people that have been left out through all these years. That's our main purpose.
Right.
It's interesting that Alejandro mentions that, because I always highlight an example from Flor de Loto. Flor de Loto has been invited twice to Rosfest. They're one of the very few Latin American bands who have gone twice to that particular prog metal festival. And one of the times that they played Rosfest, they closed the session with a very Peruvian song, right, Alejandro? I think you closed with El Condor Pasa.
We did play our version of Condor Pasa, but it was like in the middle of our show.
But what's interesting to me, because people might look at it as just another kind of like Andean song, but it's actually a protest song embedded into Flor de Loto's music. So when you research why Flor de Loto actually integrates that song into their set, it's because it's a protest song related to this particular critique of coloniality that we're talking about. So it's a great example of how decolonial metal, makes its way through the sets of some of these bands.
Just because that must have been a very special moment, Alejandro. What was the response when you played that song? There's also a hint about it in the book, Nelson, about indeed how different audiences have different reactions to these very specifically situated songs. What was the reaction at the time when you played this particular song?
Well, the crowd were amazing. We were amazed. We had a very good response. Not only playing Condor Pasa, but all of our songs or all other songs we played because of the use of the Peruvian wind instruments. People were blown away. We were very happy in that festival, not only at Rosfest in the United States, but in other festivals we have played, for example, in Italy, in France, for example. We had always had a very good reaction because of the way we mix our music.
Right. As you may have noticed, we have an additional guest. We welcome Ross Hagen, Communications Officer of ISMMS. Ross, could you briefly introduce yourself?
Yes, thank you. I'm sorry for being late. So my name is Ross Hagen. I live in Provo, Utah. Most of my background in metal as a musician and as a scholar has dealt with metal in Norway and metal with things like neo-paganism and national identity and things like that. So I'm very happy to be here. Thank you, and again, sorry for being late.
That doesn't hurt us at all. Eleanor, Rich, I'd like to ask you for a moment. As journalists, you, of course, encounter metal all over the world. And as Nelson says before, decolonial metal isn't something that is pinned down to a particular location. It's a wide umbrella of varieties. And when we were preparing this call, we asked everyone to consider in what shapes and forms they had encountered decolonial metal before, not just in music, but also in the way these bands speak to the society around them. And as journalists, you must have tremendous experience encountering such bands. Eleanor, how about you?
So I think I should probably say that the phrase decolonial metal or extreme decolonial metal, as Nelson has in his book, is really interesting. And the fact that he breaks it down into sort of these 6 categorizations. I think as journalists, we haven't necessarily considered these are decolonial metal bands, or at least I hadn't really considered that as an umbrella term. I think it's more that we've had bands that we've interviewed and we've asked them about their stories, and then it obviously comes out that a lot of their background has influenced the music, and they're writing about the various things they've had to live through. They're writing about their histories. They're writing about the effects that colonialism still has on them today. So I think it's a really good definition that Nelson has in this kind of academic sense. And it's definitely made me think a little bit more about the relationship with these bands, first of all, just in their own countries and to each other, as well. As Nelson says, there's sort of an awareness in the global south of some of these bands and the connections between them. So I think we don't necessarily think of them as decolonial metal bands, but obviously that is kind of what they are doing. And Metal Hammer recently had Alien Weaponry on the cover, and I'd say they're a pretty strong band to make the case for when it comes to decolonial metal. And I think, again, there's a lot of sort of lack of knowledge on our part, or definitely on my part, about where some of these bands had come from. And before Alien Weaponry came into the metal scene, I actually wasn't really aware of the history of New Zealand, and especially the part that England had played in it. And it was very sobering to actually read about that. And they've written songs about how people's houses, Indigenous people's houses, have been cleared when the Queen visited in the 50s and things like that. And there are all these stories about colonial powers and the effects that happened in the past and how the effects are still being felt today. And I think alien weaponry within New Zealand are part of a movement of bands and artists that are coming up that are trying to introduce the Maori language back into society. There's like a big strong push for that at the moment. And culturally, you know, Jacinda Ardern has been involved in these kind of things as well, just to get place names, like Indigenous place names recognised again, and sort of the language used. So I think we hadn't, for my part, I hadn't really considered the impact of decolonial metal, but seeing bands like Alien Weaponry has made me really kind of sit up and take notice. And another band we've really focused on is Thonic as well, from Taiwan. And there's even a debate in Taiwan about whether Taiwan is part of the global South or not because of its history. And I was reading that even had a whole exhibition in their art gallery about whether or not it was. But again, to hear their story and to hear Freddie, the singer, talk about the history of Taiwan was really powerful and not something that I knew about. And then he's taken this direct action and he's become, you know, a politician and kind of carried that through. So yeah, I think it's really trying to find out people's stories and kind of dig deeper. And I can't remember the question you asked me now, but I think in terms of decolonial metal bands, maybe I hadn't thought of it in academic terms. I hadn't thought about these relationships. But the more we sort of interview bands that have done this, the more apparent it is that this, you know, this definition really, really fits, and that I think there's a lot of history that people don't know, whether it's in Latin America or beyond, about what's actually gone on in some of the countries where these bands have come from, let alone the metal music. Like just the history itself, I think, is not always been on people's minds.
Rich, how about you? In your experience, any bands that stood out to you that you felt really taught people about those histories that, especially in the global north, are really unknown?
I mean, as kind of Eleanor said, the term decolonial metal had never really occurred when we've been discussing them in the past. But it's something that I think does perfectly describe, when we get into the stories of a lot of these bands, the things that they talk about. I mean, as was mentioned, we have Alien Weaponry. There's also a brilliant band called Shepherd's Reign from New Zealand, who are doing very much the same kind of thing as Alien Weaponry. But I mean, it goes far beyond that as well. Like when I did a piece on Sepultura's Beneath the Remains a few years ago, and we did also a piece that same year on Rock in Rio, a lot of the research on that ended up covering the military dictatorship in the country and things, just because when you start speaking to the bands, they're like, oh yeah, well, it had an effect on like our parents, and it kind of helped create a countercultural movement in the 80s that kind of fostered a lot of what is now seen as almost like the standard, which is, you know, Brazil loves rock and metal, and it's like, well, this is where it came from, and it's this idea of that having a lot of context. I mean, there's a brilliant quote in the book itself, and I'm sorry if I butcher your wonderful words here, Nelson, but I think it's metal music is and always has been a product of its context, and I think that is critical when you're talking to these bands. And when you read the book, a lot of the narratives that come up when they kind of talk about not necessarily things that have just affected them on a direct level, but just the people that they run into on everyday life. There are some incredible stories in there, and yeah, it's something that you kind of see the world over, really, especially if you start speaking to sort of Middle Eastern bands. So we've done quite a lot over the last few months on bands from Iran, from Israel, from Afghanistan, and they're talking about, you know, the impact of decades of conflict and political sort of maneuvering and religious ideologies, and a lot of that can be traced back again to colonialism ultimately. So it's a narrative that seems to be shared the world over. It's just felt in very different ways, even Eastern Europe, for instance, and Northern Ireland. So it's something that does pop up an awful lot.
Rich, I think one thing that you and Eleanor bring up that I think is very important is that even though we are kind of using the label decolonial metal to explain these bands have been in conversation with us for a long time. So they have become teaching tools for the global north to understand the experiences of the global south. But I think it's very important when we think about decolonial metal that it's not just the transformation of a band to reflect their context, because some bands transform their sounds to reflect where they come from, but they don't necessarily engage in decolonial reflections. They can do it as a gimmick, or they can do it as a way to garner attention, but it's not a decolonial reflection. And I think what ties these bands together and these reflections that Eleanor and you have kind of brought as a teaching tool is that these bands are actually focusing on histories of oppression. And that, I think, changes the game and changes the dynamic completely, because they are telling you where they come from, how those experiences of oppression were manifested then. And they draw a direct line between experiences of oppression since 15th century colonialism to now in Latin America. And that linkage of letting you know who I am and where I come from, but letting you know that history through an experience of oppression and a proposal for liberation, which is really important in decolonial metal, I think it's key for the discussion. I think that helps us understand which bands might sound regional, but which among all of those who sound regional, who regionalize their sound, which ones are actually engaging in a decolonial approach and which ones are not.
Now, what stood out to me on that note, Nelson, is also that you spoke about this at length when you defined those extreme decolonial dialogues, is that these bands are often also misunderstood. And that has to do, on the one hand, with the usual suspect, namely that metal still has to deal with a lot of prejudice about being inaccessible, about being dangerous, about being satanic, all kinds of prejudices all over the world, each in their own varieties, but also within their own communities, that these bands are dealing with topics that are considered to be taboo or are considered to be something that cannot be discussed. There was a brilliant quote in the chapter about Peru, actually, from Eloy from Cranium, who says that people don't love their roots. And that's something that stood out to me as well. I wanted to go to you, Alejandro, if you've experienced those kinds of things also, that kind of resistance in bringing this decolonial message to people.
Yes, indeed. There's a lot of people in Peru that see all the art that comes from indigenous people, like what is this? I'm not like this. I'm modern. This is for plebs. So we are trying to change that way of thinking. In fact, there's a lot of people, not only normal people that listens to music in their homes, but from the media. Here in Peru, the media don't look up to metal, to heavy metal, or to this kind of fusion. They only look up to what is give you money, to what people, what is popular among people. So they are not interested, the media, in showing or the rich culture that we have, and in decolonize. Or not only metal music, but decolonize our way of thinking, because like it has been said before, we are still being oppressed in one way or another. So we want to people that to realize that thing. You are living your life, you're going to your job, you're returning home, you're cooking your meals, and you don't realize how oppressed your people, your culture, and you are being. So the first step is to take conscious about that. Once you take conscious about what is really going on, you can do something. Okay, this is going on. What I'm going to do to change that first in my reality, so I can help other people to change that in their reality. That's what we want. It's hard, but I think it's not impossible.
And that's an internal tension in your country. The other tension that I think bands like Flor de Loto and other decolonial bands face is when we think about them embedded in a global north, global south dynamic. When we think about, for example, the way when outlets of metal music in the global north see a band like Flor de Loto, it sounds regional, it sounds ethnic, and therefore just lump it in that folk metal category. And everything is lumped into that category. And then that category becomes a thing. But that thing is never, or very, it's not frequently analyzed to kind of tease out, okay, what is happening within that category of folk metal? There are many things happening there. One of them is decoloniality, right? So there's not only the tension that a band faces in their own country, there's also the tension that a band faces when the global north categorizes them as something and doesn't really understand that the underlying critique, the decolonial critique that's happening in their music and in their sound and in their aesthetics, right? So that's a double tension that I think it's important to take into account.
That reminds me of, I think it was a band, Acronia, that you showed to my students at one point when you came up, that had, they're a band from Mexico, and at the very end of one of their songs, they had like a quote from the song Tequila.
Mm-hmm.
And it was something that I knew, like, the irony of that would be entirely lost on Americans.
Yeah.
If they heard it out of that context.
Because somebody might hear that and say, "Oh, look at, they integrated a Mexican song." So there's irony.
Or they think about Pee-wee's Big Adventure, or anything like that. And so it is this. There's this additional hurdle sometimes, but I also don't think it's necessarily the band's responsibility to get us over it. If that makes sense. Like, if we don't get it, we don't get it. But I hope we can get it. Like, but it takes work on the part of the listener.
Could you explain that? Because I know that Nelson mentions it.
I think we lost Eleanor for a minute. Eleanor, I think I lost you for a minute. Could you repeat your question?
Yeah, could you just remind us, I know it's in the book, Nelson, could you just remind us about that Tequila line, who it was that sung it and what it actually means? Because I remember when I read it in the book, I wasn't aware of the context of it either.
Yeah. Ross, do you want to take that one?
Nor do I know Pee-wee's Big Adventure, but, you know, we're British, so we haven't seen it.
Sure. Yeah, it was, so the song Tequila was, it's almost kind of a surf rock song from the late 50s. And it has this, sort of, really distinctive trumpet line. So it's like, I guess what you would call like a mariachi. So it's like American mariachi, kind of like, the other one would be, Herb Alpert and the Tijuana Brass, none of which were from Tijuana, but, it has this, like that's the sort of main melody. And most people since the 1980s know it from Pee-wee's Big Adventure, though it was a huge hit in the 50s and 60s. And when Acronia kind of, and at the very end of a fairly intense and proggy death metal song, kind of just sort of throws it in there. It sounds like, if you don't know what's happening, it sounds kind of funny in a way. Like even if you recognize it, as an American, sort of like imagining somebody listening to it out of context, it's it seems like sort of a weird, just like quote to like musical quote to throw in. But in context, it has this feeling of, oh, like this is what you think about us.
Because the initial song is about colonialism. Acronia is singing about colonialism, and then at the very end, throwing in your face kind of like the stereotypical sound that you would expect me to play as a Mexican, and so it's a brilliant example, I think.
I see.
Yeah.
We used to play that in my school band actually, so I I know the song you mean.
Yeah, and if you don't know where they're coming from and what they're singing about, it just completely goes over your head.
I think that throws a particular question our way, especially for fans of metal who want to get a better understanding of what decolonial metal in all of its varieties is about. Is Nelson, in your experience, how can people who want to get a better, more in-depth understanding, how can they encounter decolonial metal in a way that isn't going over their heads because they know it from Pee-wee's Big Adventure or varieties of that movie?
This is going to turn into the book presentation where Pee-wee is mentioned more than anything else. No, but all kidding aside, it's Ross's fault, but that's cool. No, all kidding aside, I think decolonial metal and metal music who engages decoloniality in Latin America and throughout the global South requires very active listening. This is not passive listening, because it requires that somebody who is actually listening to something that's different researches why that difference is embedded in that music, and the why links itself in a lot of occasions to the colonial setting. So, for example, let me go back to the Acrania example that Ross brought up. If you listen to that song, it's called "People of the Blaze," and you just listen to it, and you just think to yourself, well, it sounds Mexican. I mean, it's death, it's prog, and at the end, it sounds Mexican. You're missing out, because you need to understand where do the lyrics come from? They come from a decolonial text who is criticizing the long-term effects of coloniality. So you kind of have to become an active listener and try to understand how the context that those bands are transmitting through their music actually is linked to the colonial experience, right? I'll give you an example of being an active listener, but an active writer. And I'll use Rich as an example here. When Rich writes about the global South, one thing that always impresses me about his work is that he not only wants to talk to the researcher, he wants to speak to the bands. And to me, that's a key component of understanding where these bands are coming from. We just can't write about decolonial bands as if they were objects, that without having a conversation with them or integrating them into our work, we write about them from a position of power. We really do need to understand where they're coming from. And part of understanding where they're coming from is to have them become part of the conversation. So that's why, for example, in our team, we publish academic work alongside metal bands. We collaborate with them hand in hand for the documentary work. And I think that's the same logic why Rich talks to the bands directly when he writes about metal music in the global South, because it's a way of recognizing that you need to become an active listener and an active writer.
You were a second ahead of me there, Nelson, because I was indeed gonna go to Rich, who has written a lot of these articles indeed about various bands in the global South who are all in their own way decolonial. How do you go about these conversations, Rich? Do you just kind of go in and ask them to talk about these experiences? Is it something that comes up gradually in the conversation?
It's entirely dependent on the band, really. Some bands are very effusive and very involved in the conversation anyway, so they'll direct it. Like, we recently did a piece on the band Confess, who were quite sort of notoriously imprisoned in Iran and have had to sort of flee to Norway to continue living the way they want to live. And the singer of that band, Nicken, is fantastic. Like, he does not hold back with any of his opinions. He tells you everything that you need to know about the story, whereas there are other people that you speak to who are obviously a lot more reserved. I think it depends as well on what level of communication you can have with a band. I mean, I'm sure Eleanor can attest to this, but obviously there are certain bands that we deal with and that we love, but there is a language barrier, so we have to work through interpreters, we have to work through translators. You have to find some way of bridging that, so it's not always possible to get, a direct quote from a band, but at the same time, from our perspective, I suppose it's not really it's not a great thing to do a story on a band and never give the band the voice to actually share their story, because what's the point in that story? And it's essentially our opinion on it.
But in credit to your work and in credit to Eleanor's work with Metal Hammer, you are doing that. So because I've seen you contact bands in Latin America to actually have that conversation, even though the language barrier is there. And we do it in different ways. We translate, we go back and forth, but it's a way of getting those voices out there. And it's a way of getting voices that are actually talking about decoloniality out there into the larger conversation. I think it's very important.
I think there's something also that stood out to me, Nelson, in some of your other work, especially when you look at, for example, one of your articles, which is, I guess, one of the cornerstones of this book, is at some point you wrote about your field work in Puerto Rico, that you also did, for example, exhibitions as a way of giving back to the communities, the metal communities whose stories you're using for academic research also. Is it something also that you think can contribute to creating a more in-depth understanding, and not just exhibitions, but also documentaries?
Well, I think just like when I started my research, I started in Puerto Rico. I was living there. So you start where you're at and you start researching what's happening all around you. I think that's very common. And one of the main things that kind of jumps out doing research in Puerto Rico is a modern day colony. So it's still a colony of the US. And you can see metal tackle things like, for example, the use of parts of Puerto Rico as a bombing site by the US Navy. And metal has tackled that. Metal still tackles today the denialism surrounding Hurricane Maria and the number of dead people after that hurricane. So those are manifestations of coloniality. It's today in Puerto Rico, and metal has tackled that. So from my perspective, if metal is teaching me about a decolonial approach, then I have to think about in what other aspects of my life can I implement a decolonial approach moving forward. And as a researcher, I think the most logical way of thinking about that is if I'm learning about decoloniality for metal music, then how can I research metal in a decolonial manner? And from my perspective, that entails engaging in research where the communities who are, in that study actually become part of the study, not only as subjects, but also as active authors, as people who are actually active leaders in the research process. So I'll give you examples of how that takes place. In our documentaries, there's always people from the scenes that we're engaging in research, actively working in the production side of the film. Everything from the artwork to sound to music, it's communities engaged in the production of knowledge. Another example might be the way that you share your results. Metal communities don't have $150 to spend on an academic book. So you better find ways to share the information that they give you in more in outlets that are more keen to the community for community consumption. That's why I think the collaboration with Metal Hammer has been so great and decolonial in some way, shape, or form, because Metal Hammer translates this research in ways that the community enjoys reading, right? And the Latin American communities metal bands who have been in the films and in the book and who have appeared in Metal Hammer see that as a way of becoming even more involved in research studies. And I think the other thing that's important if you take a decolonial approach is to recognize that you are also part of these communities, because as I mentioned in my introduction, I have been a metal fan longer than I have been a social scientist. So I am part of that community too. And a way of sharing information there is to take it outside of traditional academic outlets. So we've seen our team present research finding at bars, for example. So all of a sudden, for the very first time in your life, you're not presenting in an academic conference, you're presenting in a bar. And I think that's a key component of giving back information to the community. That, to me, it's a very decolonial approach. So when Eleanor and Rich were saying, the metal bands that we interview are giving us this information, the metal bands are becoming a teaching tool. about decoloniality, not only for other metal fans throughout the world, but also for researchers who are engaging metal bands in the global South in ways of engaging in social research that's decolonial to the core, in the way that it approaches the other. I think that's really important too.
Yeah, I have to say, I had a similar experience when I was doing my research with indigenous metal bands from Aotearoa, New Zealand, that I entered those conversations not as a researcher, but I found out it was the best way to enter the conversations was just as a fellow metal fan. And our conversations occasionally trailed off to moments where we almost died in the pit, which were very cathartic experiences, to say the least.
In the example of decolonial metal is crucial because, for example, I'll give you an example with Alejandro and the conversations that I've had with Flor de Loto. I've never lived in Peru, right? But having lived in the Caribbean, I can understand the experiences of racism in the Caribbean setting. So you find an analogy between your experiences of racism where you live and the experiences of racism by the people you're talking to as part of your research. So even though I haven't lived in Peru and Alejandro hasn't lived in Puerto Rico, we can still converse about the long-lasting effects of coloniality and racism in our countries. And I think those are conversations that bring metal bands throughout the global South together. So alien weaponry might not know about Flor de Loto, but they are connected. They are connected through a history of colonization. And I think that's key to me.
I find it incredibly interesting how many bands do seem to be aware of things happening on other parts of the world. The number of bands that I speak to that are in communication, say from even like some of the Afghanistan bands that I spoke to, like Saga, who were telling me, oh yeah, no, I'm in contact with some guys from Argentina and they're telling me their story and how much our music means to them because they can identify. And there is a commonality, I think, that comes through the music sometimes that really unites it all together.
I was going to say the same thing, just it's a slightly different geographical context, but talking of alien weaponry, I went to see them play in the Navajo Nation. And obviously, again, like I said, it's a different geographical context, but it's still, they were sharing their experiences of their backgrounds and what it's been like to be part of this indigenous population that had all these injustices perpetrated against them and that are still carrying on today. So even in that kind of context, there's that exchange going on there, which is really interesting.
This is why I think that's a great example of alien weaponry playing in the Navajo Nation Festival, because this is why I think it's very important to have this conversation about decolonial metal now, because these bands are beginning to find each other throughout the world, and they are beginning to recognize that they are talking about the same story. It's a story of colonization, and that brings them all together. And I think that has the potential, and I don't want to be overly optimistic, but it has the potential to help people who live in the global South throughout that history of coloniality address it, recognize it, address it in their own lives. But it also has the potential to actually change metal as we know it, because it has the potential to have a deeper conversation about how we use extremity in our everyday music to talk about other experiences of extremity that we live through. So I think it has a lot of potential for, changing the way that we see metal music in general.
I have to say that's something that definitely resonated with me in the book, going back to the Peru chapter again, is that at some point there was this call for more realismo. And that was something that actually was met with a lot of resistance. It was the words of Eloy from Cranium also, who said, we need to involve the real world around us. For me, living in Peru, why would I sing about Satanism and cars or driving through hell? I'm already living in hell. Is that something for you, Alejandro, for example? Is that something that you felt the same way about, that you say this is something that's also, I hope, will happen more, that more bands will involve this kind of reality in their music?
Yes, because we are not in the 80s anymore. It's not only about sex, drugs, and rock and roll. There's other things to talk about. It's not only about singing about dragons and saving the princess. I mean, all that is cool, but there has to be one point when you're saying, okay, by making music, I have a power. I have a power of reaching a lot of people. So what can I do with that power? So I can talk about all these real things, all the shit that is going on, so that people can realize, hey, metal music is more. It's more about getting drunk and getting laid. Metal music is about protest. It's about saying no to your government. It's about saying, okay, we are fed up about this. We're going to do something else. So that's what we are trying to do as a band, for example. I think you can make a parallel with blues music in United States. I mean, blues is not only cool music using pentatonic scale. Blues is about slavery, what happened in the United States. So Latin American bands, metal bands, we are trying to make the same thing, to make people realizing our history, not only Latin American peoples, because people around the world. That's our goal.
I think at about 45 minutes, I think it's maybe time to start rounding out or closing down a little bit. Nelson, I want to return to you very briefly, kind of as a takeaway. We've been talking as a main takeaway of the conversation. We've been talking about decolonial metal as an umbrella with so many varieties. We've been talking about its capacity to transform not just the society in which it comes about, but also metal at large, like Alejandro has just described. Is that something for you? You said, I don't want to sound too overly optimistic. I kind of feel like we can be optimistic. Is it something to be optimistic about, that this will indeed change what metal is, and that it will perhaps also draw more people in?
Well, I am always torn between being superly hopeful and overly pessimistic. So, I mean, the balance to me here is that when you think about the role of music in social protest, for example, during the 60s, you think about one or two artists that kind of like spurred a movement, a train of thought, an idea, right? And what we have now, I think it's much more than that. We have a lot of bands from the Global South talking about this phenomenon, the idea of coloniality. So I think there's hope there in terms of having metal join other forms of art that have already taken steps towards becoming decolonial, towards challenging coloniality. And it might be new to metal, but I think it's a good way of thinking that metal joins the ranks of other forms of artwork who are actually doing that and have been doing that for a long time. So that to me is very hopeful. The pessimistic side of me always says, well, be careful, because sometimes things that are very different and people don't really understand what it is that they're doing or where they're coming from tend to be categorized as a form of control. So my main concern now is the kind of like ongoing discussion, for example, about, and I mentioned this before, folk metal. I think there's a whole host of things that are folk that have nothing to do with decoloniality. And unfortunately, there are a whole host of things that are decolonial that are being lumped into the folk category because people just don't want to think about it. It's a lot of work becoming familiar with the history of these bands and their settings and what they're trying to do and what they're trying to say and the challenges of language, right? Those things are hard to do. So that's why I think I mentioned the importance of the active listener. So I am torn between this idea of being hopeful for the future, also being cautiously a bit pessimistic about how it's going to be received. But regardless of how I feel, I think it's a growing trend. And the bands that are actually engaging in it are doing it, they're doing it from the heart. They're doing it from a place of having others understand the plights that they have lived through and the ways that they're actually actively engaging to liberate themselves from those plights, those colonial plights. So I think it's in the end, it's gonna be in their hands to see where they're gonna take these collaborations and this global South movement of decolonial metal moving forward. my hope is that they continue doing it because I think it's very, very important.
Nelson, could I ask you a quick question if there's time?
Sure, of course.
I just wondered what you thought about bands from the global north, like what their role is in helping bands from the global south to do that. Because if you look at a band we had on the cover recently, Gojira, they have a song that is all about difficulties with indigenous populations in Brazil and
true.
the fires and their homes.
That's a great example. You just picked my brain.
Yeah. Is that good for you to see? Like, and where's the line between sort of bands from the global north taking part in activism and like stepping back and letting the people from those countries have their own voice?
I think it's always going to be welcome, and it's always going to be important that bands from the global north speak about the plights of bands in the global south. I think it garners attention and it can be useful. What's important is to always recognize that there's going to be a tension there, because some of us are going to say, well, how come everybody's celebrating Gojira's talking about the Amazon when Ratos de Porão did that decades ago in Brazil and nobody paid attention to them? So there's there's always a tension there of who is the speaker about these experiences of oppression. So it's always important for people in the global north, a band like Gojira, to not only speak about the plight of the Amazon, but also recognize who are those metal artists who are actually living there and writing and talking about that plight, right? So there's a dual responsibility of making people aware of the problem, but also recognizing the people who are, suffering through it, singing through it, making metal through it regionally. And that's a responsibility that metal in the global north will always have, because metal in the global north has attributed to itself the control of history, right? This is the history of metal as told through the eyes of the global north, but the history of metal is much more complex than that. And it's being told throughout the global south. So there's always a dual responsibility, to put forward and make people aware of the plights being faced, like Gojira is doing, but also at the same time to recognize those people who have been doing it for a really long time in those particular settings, which is exactly what I think Metal Hammers has been doing with these reports, right? Talking about the global south in collaboration with the global south, not from the global north. I think that's a great example of how to do it moving forward.
I think also if you listen actively, I think you can also find examples of bands in the global north, from the United States to Belgium to anywhere in the global north, that also actively decolonize within their own setting. I think, for example, a band like Wayfarer released an album where they deconstructed this ideal image of the gunslinger. And to me, that also counts as an example of decolonization, because it just completely takes apart this image that we have constructed of the hero, but we have completely glossed over the genocide of Native Americans that comes with that image of a hero. So I think there's also indeed that decoloniality isn't just limited to the global south.
No, it's not. Yeah, that's a great point, Didier. Take, for example, a band like La Armada. La Armada, it's a hardcore band from Chicago, right? But they are initially from the Dominican Republic, living in Chicago. So this is a global South band living in the global North, still doing decolonial work, but they are in the global North. So we should never equate doing decolonial metal to living in the global South. There are bands in the global North also doing decolonial metal, because they are challenging the link between coloniality and modernity. And I think that's a key component, a key takeaway, right? Decolonial metal is everywhere. It's just a matter of looking for it. It's there.
To spur everyone who has been listening and is still here with us, thank you all for still being here. And to spur you on, we will definitely link to each of the bands that we've mentioned in the past discussion in the description. We'll also link you to Nelson's latest documentary, Act of Resistance, which is a very good example of these documentaries that he has been making over the past couple of years that show you what decolonial metal in Latin America is about and what many different forms it can take. We're going to close the discussion here. I want to thank each and every one of you, Eleanor, Rich, Alejandro, Ross, and finally Nelson, the author of Decolonial Metal in Latin America, which is out now at Intellect, publishing house in the UK. Thank you all so much for your time, for being here, and we hope to see each other again in the future. Keep doing all the great work that you are doing, and take care, everyone.